Hello and welcome to the Most Maligned Horror Podcast. This is a show offering critical analysis and contextualization of the horror films of the 2000s. My name is Macaulay Elijah Quinn. I am a filmmaker and film critic, and on today's episode we are going to be discussing the August 2000 film Bless the Child, a thoughtless, head-empty vibes film inexplicably directed by Chuck Russell, director of the 1988 Blob, Nightmare on Elm Street 3, The Mask, Eraser, and, most surprising, The Scorpion King.
I don't think you understand. Cody's very special.
You're a psychiatric nurse, Maggie. You know the diagnosis as well as I do.
I used to think it was autism too, but I'm not so sure anymore. It's as if she's listening to something we can't hear or see.
A few episodes back, we talked about the film The Prophecy 3: The Ascent, starring Christopher Walken as the Archangel Gabriel. And I spent a lot of time on that episode talking about the direct-to-video marketplace and direct-to-video sequels, and comparatively little talking about the religious aspects of that film's story. And one of the reasons for this is I just sort of felt unequipped to do so. I did not grow up in a religious household. I don't have any sort of religious background. We attended church when I was a child, but only very briefly, like literally a matter of weeks, not even months, weeks. And so I don't have a knowledge of the Bible, of biblical stories, biblical characters, though I do find all of that stuff really fascinating. American Christianity in particular I find really fascinating. The existence of megachurches and things like that, I find it really hard to wrap my head around those. But it wasn't a world that I grew up in, and so it felt a little bit sort of disingenuous for me to talk about the religious aspects of one of these films. Though I knew I would have to deal with it at some point, and some point soon. In the 1990s and continuing into the 2000s, there was a big resurgence of horror films based in religion. Stories of the Antichrist, of demon possession, of the apocalypse. They were really popular at this time, and this was just something that I had observed, but I didn't really have an understanding of like why this might be. Culturally, historically, I didn't understand why these films came back in such a big way at the time that they did. And so I've been doing some reading over the past few weeks. I've been doing some research, and I came across a piece by the historian Karina Wilson called Psychos and Pomo on the website Horror Film History. And it is a tremendous piece of writing. I will link to it in the episode description. In it, she's working to sort of contextualize these films and to put them into conversation with the broader grunge movement. Grunge music was a response to the bombast of the 1980s. It presented itself as the antithesis of the rock and roll and hair metal music that had dominated the culture in the 1980s. Compared to those movements, it was raw, it was gritty, it was real. As well, it was very politically minded. In the 1980s, thanks in no small part to then President Ronald Reagan, the American people were doing significantly worse than they ever had before. While a select few had gotten exceedingly wealthy on the back of Reaganomics, the vast majority of Americans were doing far, far worse. They were working longer hours for less pay, which is an ongoing motif on this show so far. And rather than shy away from any of this, grunge put it front and center. What Karina Wilson is saying in her piece is that, similar to the rise of grunge, the rise of religious horror in the 90s was sort of seen as countercultural. It was a repudiation of the schlock horror which had defined the previous decade. These films were not just about angels and demons, they were about the very nature of man, about the good and evil which we might all be capable of. And in this way, the films were far more grounded in reality than, say, a Friday the 13th sequel. What she doesn't really comment on in her piece is the anxiety surrounding Y2K, surrounding the Millennium Bug.
The Millennium Bug. Much has been written and discussed lately about this so-called Year 2000 computer bug. The government, financial institutions, and big business are spending millions of dollars on this computer glitch called the Y2K, or Year 2000 problem. What is it, and why all the fuss?
It might sound ridiculous now, but at the time, many people did believe that Y2K would be the end of the world, and this fear was not unfounded. It's worth saying it's only because of the hard work of thousands of individuals that a crisis was averted. This could have really been a disaster. It might not have been the end of the world the way that people feared, but it would have been terrible. For people living in the 1990s, the end of the world felt as real and as close as it would have done for the people who grew up during the Cold War. And so in some ways, it makes sense that films about the apocalypse, about the second coming of Christ, about the nature of man, would be really popular in the 1990s. And it makes sense that that would continue in the 2000s, particularly post 9/11, when again, the end of the world felt very, very close. With that being said, Bless the Child is not a very deep film. It is not a very thoughtful film. And what I mean by this is I don't believe that the film really has anything substantive to say about the world, about sort of the nature of our way of being. And what it does say, I think, is quite repulsive. For those of you who haven't seen the film, Bless the Child is about a woman named Maggie who is raising her autistic niece after her sister Jenna dumps her on Maggie's doorstep. 6 years later, her sister suddenly reappears and abducts the child, and it's ultimately revealed that Cody, the autistic child, is some sort of prophet of God, and that her sister has abducted her in order to bring her to a satanic cult. From that description, and given the director's previous body of work, you might be expecting a pretty sort of taut action thriller, and unfortunately, no, very little of consequence actually happens in this film. Outside of a couple of like Meet Joe Black-esque car crash scenes, there's very little going on visually in the film. Thematically, it's all pretty boilerplate. The film relies really heavily on tropes, and this is what I mean by the film is thoughtless. The filmmakers didn't consider what tropes they were deploying or how they were deploying them, how they would be received by audiences. You might have noticed, for example, that in my plot synopsis, I put a lot of emphasis on Cody's having autism, and that's because for the first half of the movie, that's really the only character note that Cody has. Autistic, different, these are the terms that define her as a person. Watching the film, I was reminded of Stephen King's writing and the ways that he will often deploy tropes in his work somewhat thoughtlessly, particularly the magical Negro trope. There are 3 magical Negro characters that show up over the course of this film's 107 minutes, but especially in the ways that the film valorizes the disabled. There is a very particular way that Stephen King will write disabled characters, characters with learning disabilities or with physical impairments, that is very cloying, let's say. It has a particular affect to it. He valorizes these characters, but in a way that is in a way that denies them personhood. It's very infantilizing. He treats his disabled characters as children, regardless of their age or maturity. And it ends up having this real sort of aw shucksy, like out of the mouth of babes sort of vibe to it that's I find it really, really grotesque, honestly. I find it very hard to read. And that's one of the reasons that I haven't read a whole lot of Stephen King's work. And it's the same mode that Bless the Child is working in.
It must be that poor bird. It flew into a window and broke its neck. They're all quite curious about death.
Do you think they understand death?
You'd be surprised. I blame the Lion King.
Very early on, Cody is sent to a school for the learning disabled, and the way that the film frames the other characters at this school, the other students, is, I think, really illustrative of this point. None of the students here are individuals. They are only ever framed in group shots, and they are sort of meant to stand in for a sort of broader idea of the learning disabled. You hear it in the dialogue as well, the ways that the characters in charge of the school talk about their students is as a group. They don't talk about the individual students, they talk about the class. It doesn't help either that we're introduced to the class in a scene where they are all gathered around a dead bird, a scene that references the trope of the mentally disabled being fascinated with the concept of death, a trope that was like old and outdated even at the time of this film's making. It's horrible. And paired with the way that the film sort of deals with mentally ill characters with depression or with substance abuse issues, the whole thing just becomes really fraught. So in my plot synopsis, I mentioned that Maggie's sister dumped Cody on her doorstep. And the reason that she does this is because she is addicted to heroin. She is in the throes of addiction and she wants a better life for her child, and so she leaves her with Maggie. Now, Maggie has no sympathy for Jenna whatsoever. She chides her, she just sort of belittles her, and ultimately I think it's her actions that ultimately drive Jenna away, although I don't think that's what the filmmakers wanted us to think. Now, we don't see or hear from Jenna for a good half hour. It's about the end of the first act that she shows up and abducts her child in order to indoctrinate her into a satanic cult being run out of a mental health and addiction facility. That's right, folks. The big bad of this film is a mental health practitioner. This film simultaneously hates the mentally ill and also hates mental health practitioners. It sees them as preying upon the people on the lowest rungs of society, but simultaneously is fear-mongering around those same people. It's saying these people are dangerous. These people are like unfit to be in normal society. But also, if they try to seek help, well, those doctors, they're also evil. They're also just like working for their own ends. It is truly despicable, and I think as well is representative of a lot of sort of modern Christian, American Christian thinking.
You're beautiful. I wish you not to do that.
It's from my father. He's very traditional.
A few years back, I got really into watching modern American Christian cinema. Films like God's Not Dead, I'm Not Ashamed, A Case for Christ. Basically, PureFlix's entire back catalogue. And one of the things that I found really fascinating about those films was the filmmakers' simultaneous and contradictory needs. It's no surprise that these films would valorize Christianity, presenting it as being the dominant religion, the ultimate winner of the so-called culture war. But what was surprising, at least to me, was their simultaneous desire to be seen as the underdog, the sort of the Christian David fighting the liberal Goliath. And for this to be narratively true, the filmmakers would have to present Christianity as being under attack from all directions. And so they would drum up fear around all manner of people. They would drum it up about foreigners, they would drum it up around the mentally ill, they would drum it up around scientists and around doctors. Everybody was viewed as a potential threat. And yet, they simultaneously had to say, "You are welcome. Our church welcomes you. If you're a lawyer or a doctor or a scientist or a foreigner or somebody suffering from drug addiction, we welcome you. Our church welcomes you." Never mind the fact that we've spent the last 90 minutes calling you the scum of the earth, hoping and praying for the rapture to extinguish you. Never mind all that. We're here for you. Our doors are always open. It was maddening, and ultimately I believe that it's because these films are not made to convert anybody. These films are made for the people who already hold these beliefs. Our way of life is being challenged. We are under attack from threats at home and abroad, but don't worry, because our victory is already secure. We might be the little guys, but soon, very soon, we'll be the big guys. And when that happens, oh boy, are we going to make these motherfuckers pay. And anybody who falls before our time comes, well, they're just martyrs for the cause. Christian cinema loves a martyr. I was actually kind of surprised that this film didn't end with Cody's death. I thought that she was going to be killed, maybe resurrected, but I guess that the filmmakers thought that that would be in bad taste, and so they sort of try to have their cake and eat it too by killing Maggie, having her resurrected. She dies trying to save Cody, the film's Christ figure. But luckily 3 angels descend and are able to bring her back. And isn't that all wonderful? And the film ends with the 3 main characters, going to Mass on Sunday. Just extraordinary stuff. I said at the end of last episode that I was very excited to see what came next for the Ju-On franchise, and I'm simultaneously quite excited to see what happens to these religious horror films. I'm curious to see how they evolve over the decade, because these types of films, this was like horror's bread and butter throughout the 70s. You know, after The Exorcist, there was a lot of these types of movies made, but they had a very different feel to them. And based on the few that I've seen from this time period, I feel like they became a lot more sanitized, a lot more sort of sterile. Films like The Devils or The Sentinel took really big swings, and you compare that to something like The Fallen from, is it 2005 or 6 that film came out? It doesn't really compare, and so I'm very curious to see what's next, what the evolution of this genre is. As well, I'm very curious to see who the villains of these stories are, particularly post 9/11. I want to see what happens there. Do these films become more sort of overtly conservative? Because I would certainly classify Bless the Child as a conservative film, but I believe that if you asked anybody involved in its creation about it, I think that they would probably say that they were leaning more sort of liberal. That, though, is all in the future. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. I want to thank Janka Glonis for the use of her track Slime Dripping Down the Walls off of the album Fun Time Party Gal. A link to that album and to their Bandcamp can be found in the episode description. If you want to get in touch with the show, you can do that on Twitter at Most Maligned. You can also send emails to mostmaligned@gmail.com. If you could please take a moment to leave a rating and review on your podcast platform of choice, that would be really helpful for the show. Next episode, we are going to be covering the August 2000 film The Cell, which is one of the big ones, I think. This is a film that a lot of people have fond memories of. When I watched it as a teenager, I had very sort of mixed feelings on it, and I'm curious to return to it because I think that it was, in a lot of ways, ahead of its time, but simultaneously, I think, quite dated. So, very curious to dig into that one. Until then, though, this has been the Most Maligned Horror Podcast.